My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 29 years old. When my phone buzzed at 3:17 a.m. with my father's panicked voice telling me my apartment building was engulfed in flames, I did something that left him speechless. I laughed. Not a nervous giggle, but deep, uncontrollable laughter that made him question my sanity. How could losing everything I owned be funny? The answer to that question changed both our lives forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The harsh vibration of my phone cut through the silence of my cramped studio apartment in Portland's industrial district. I fumbled for it in the darkness, knocking over an empty coffee cup that had been sitting on my nightstand for 3 days. The screen's blue glow hurt my eyes as I squinted at the caller ID. Dad. My heart immediately jumped to the worst-case scenarios that plague every adult child when their parent call in the middle of the night. Mom's heart condition, his diabetes complications, a car accident. Rebecca? His voice was tight with urgency. Thank God you answered. Are you at home? Dad. What's wrong? Is Mom okay? I sat up, fully alert now, my mind racing through possibilities. Your mother's fine, sweetheart, but I'm looking at live footage on Channel 12, and your building is on fire. The whole structure is going up in flames. Please tell me you're somewhere else tonight. For a moment, his words didn't register. My building? I looked around the tiny studio that had been my home for the past 18 months. Everything was quiet. The only sounds were the usual urban symphony of distant traffic and my upstairs neighbor's perpetually dripping faucet. What do you mean? My building's on fire? The brick complex on Industrial Boulevard, they're showing it live on the news, started about 20 minutes ago. The fire department said it spread incredibly fast. Rebecca, where are you right now? That's when it hit me, and the laughter started bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest. Not a polite chuckle or nervous laugh, but full-blown, tears streaming down my face laughter that I couldn't control. Rebecca! Why are you laughing? This isn't funny. Do you have renter's insurance? I tried to speak between gasps of laughter, but every time I thought about the irony of the situation, another wave hit me. My father's voice grew more concerned with each passing second. Honey, talk to me. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Should I call someone? Finally, I caught my breath enough to explain. Dad, I'm not in the building because I'm at the hospital. I've been here for the past 6 hours. The hospital? Are you hurt? What happened? No, I'm fine. I'm here because of Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen was my elderly neighbor from apartment 3B, an 84-year-old retired seamstress who had become like a grandmother to me over the past year and a half. She lived alone, and I was often the only person she saw for days at a time. We had developed a routine where I'd check on her every few days, bringing groceries or just sitting with her while she told stories about her late husband's fishing adventures. 3 days ago, Mrs. Chen had mentioned feeling dizzy during one of our conversations. Yesterday morning, when I knocked on her door for our usual Tuesday coffee, she didn't answer. I used the spare key she had given me for emergencies and found her collapsed in her kitchen, conscious but weak and confused. The paramedics said she was severely dehydrated and had dangerously low blood sugar. At 84, with no family nearby, the hospital staff told me she would need someone to stay with her, at least for the first night, to advocate for her care and provide comfort in the unfamiliar environment. I hadn't hesitated. I called in sick to my job at the marketing firm, packed a small overnight bag, and settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair next to Mrs. Chen's bed. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally gripping my hand when she was awake, whispering thank you in her broken English mixed with Mandarin. So you're telling me, my father said slowly, that the one night you're not in your apartment is the night it burns down? Because you were taking care of your neighbor? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Another wave of laughter hit me as I glanced over at Mrs. Chen, who was sleeping peacefully under the hospital's fluorescent lights. Dad, if she hadn't gotten sick, if I hadn't found her yesterday, if the hospital hadn't required someone to stay with her, I would have been sound asleep in apartment 3A when that fire started. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, my father's voice came through, quiet and shaken. Rebecca, do you realize what you're saying? You might have died tonight if you hadn't been caring for someone else. The full weight of that reality was just beginning to sink in. I had spent so many nights in that apartment, often wearing noise-canceling headphones while working on freelance graphic design projects late into the night. If a fire had started, in the middle of the night, especially one that spread as quickly as my father described, I might not have woken up in time. "Where's Mrs. Chen's family?" he asked. "She doesn't have any nearby. Her son lives in San Francisco, but they're not close. Her husband died 8 years ago. She's basically alone except for me." My father was quiet again, and I could hear the faint sound of news coverage in the background at his house in Sacramento. My parents had been following my struggles in Portland with a mixture of support and concern. They had wanted me to move back home after I graduated from UC Davis with my graphic design degree, but I was determined to make it on my own in a bigger city with more opportunities. Portland had been a compromise between my dreams of moving to Seattle or San Francisco and my parents' hopes that I'd stay closer to home. It was far enough away to feel independent but close enough for weekend visits. The reality had been much harder than I anticipated. The marketing firm where I worked was small and disorganized. My boss, Janet Crawford, was brilliant but scattered, often forgetting to approve expense reports or process paychecks on time. The salary was barely enough to cover rent, food, and student loans, leaving nothing for extras like renter's insurance, regular dental checkups, or even a reliable car. I had been living paycheck to paycheck, taking on freelance design work in the evenings and weekends to make ends meet. The apartment was small and far from glamorous, but it was mine. The rent was affordable, and it was walking distance to both work and the coffee shop where I spent most of my free time working on personal projects. More importantly, it was where I had built the first real community of my adult life. There was Mrs. Chen, of course, but also Marcus Williams, the jazz musician in 2C who practiced saxophone at respectful volumes and always held the door for residents carrying groceries. Sarah and Tom Brennan in 1A had twin toddlers and occasionally asked me to babysit when their regular sitter was unavailable. Even Mr. Rodriguez, the building superintendent, had become a familiar, friendly face who remembered my name and asked about my work. "Rebecca, what about all your things? Your computer, your clothes, your design equipment?" The laughter threatened to return, but this time it carried a different edge. "Dad, you know what the funny thing is? I don't think I really care about most of it." That wasn't entirely true. My laptop contained years of design work, including projects I had never backed up properly. My camera, which I used for both professional and personal photography, was expensive and irreplaceable. The portfolio of physical design samples I had been building since college was sitting in a filing cabinet next to my desk. But as I sat in that hospital chair, watching Mrs. Chen's chest rise and fall steadily, thinking about how different this night could have ended, material possessions suddenly felt insignificant. "What do you mean you don't care about it?" "I mean, Dad, 3 months ago I was working 60-hour weeks trying to save up enough money to buy a better computer and maybe move to a nicer apartment. I was stressed about everything I didn't have, everything I couldn't afford. I've been so focused on building this perfect life that I forgot to actually live it. But you worked so hard for those things." I did. And maybe that's the problem. I was working so hard to acquire stuff that I wasn't paying attention to what actually mattered. Mrs. Chen has been alone in that apartment for months, and I only started really spending time with her because I was too broke to go out on weekends. If I had been busier, more successful, would I have even noticed she was in trouble? My father didn't answer immediately. I could hear him processing what I was saying. probably trying to decide if his daughter had lost her mind along with her possessions. The truth was, I had been questioning everything about my life in Portland for weeks before the fire. The job at the marketing firm was going nowhere. Janet had promised me a promotion and raise that never materialized. The freelance work was inconsistent and often involved clients who either paid late or tried to negotiate down the agreed-upon rates. I had been considering moving back to Sacramento, maybe living with my parents for a few months while I figured out my next step. The idea had felt like admitting failure, like giving up on the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. But lying awake in my small apartment night after night, calculating how many peanut butter sandwiches I could afford to eat before my next paycheck, I had started to wonder if pride was worth the constant stress and uncertainty. Honey, I think you might be in shock. People don't usually laugh when they lose their homes. Maybe I am in shock. Or maybe I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in months. Mrs. Chen stirred in her hospital bed, opening her eyes and looking around with the confusion common to elderly patients waking up in unfamiliar places. I reached for her hand, and her grip was stronger than it had been earlier in the evening. "Rebecca," she whispered, her accent thick with sleep and medication. "You're still here." "Of course I'm still here, Mrs. Chen. How are you feeling?" "Better, much better." The nice nurse brought me soup. She noticed I was holding my phone. "Is everything okay?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I looked at this woman who barely knew me but had become one of the most important people in my life, and I realized something that made me want to laugh all over again. "Everything is perfect, Mrs. Chen. Everything is exactly as it should be." My father was still on the line, and I could hear him talking to my mother in the background, their voices a mixture of concern and confusion. They were probably discussing whether they should drive to Portland immediately, whether their daughter had suffered some kind of mental break along with her material losses. "Dad, I need to go. Mrs. Chen is awake, and I want to be here when the doctor makes rounds in the morning." "Rebecca, wait. What are you going to do? Where are you going to live? Do you need us to drive up there?" For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely calm about an uncertain future. "I don't know yet, Dad, but I'll figure it out." "And Dad? Thank you for calling to check on me. I love you." After I hung up, I sat back in the hospital chair and looked around the sterile room. Mrs. Chen had fallen back asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Outside the window, Portland's city lights twinkled in the distance. And somewhere among them, my former life was literally going up in smoke. Instead of feeling devastated, I felt liberated. For the first time since moving to Portland, I wasn't worried about rent, or whether I could afford groceries, or how I would pay for car repairs. All of those concerns had been erased in a single night, leaving space for possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. The fire had taken my possessions, but it had also taken my excuses. I could no longer tell myself I was trapped in a job I hated because I needed the security. I could no longer avoid making difficult decisions about my future because I was too invested in maintaining the status quo. Everything that had been keeping me stuck was gone, and what remained was a blank slate and an 84-year-old woman who needed someone to care about her. As I settled back into the uncomfortable chair for what would be my second night in the hospital, I found myself smiling. Tomorrow would bring challenges I couldn't even imagine yet, but tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be. I grew up in Riverside, California, in a neighborhood where the houses all looked similar and everyone knew each other's business. My father, Robert Martinez, managed the parts department at the local Ford dealership, a job he had held for 23 years. He believed deeply in the value of steady employment, reliable benefits, and planning for retirement. My mother, Linda, taught 4th grade at the elementary school I had attended as a child, bringing home stories about her students and stacks of papers to grade every evening. Our house was small but immaculate, with a front yard my father watered religiously every morning before work and a back patio where my mother grew tomatoes and herbs in carefully arranged pots. Dinner was served at 6 o'clock sharp, followed by homework time at the kitchen table while my parents watched the evening news. It was a predictable life, built on routines and modest goals. My parents' idea of financial risk was switching from generic brands to name-brand cereal at the grocery store. They had saved methodically for my college education since I was in kindergarten, contributing small amounts to a 529 plan every month without fail. The plan was clear from the time I could understand such things. Study hard, get good grades, attend a state university for something practical like business or education, find a stable job with benefits, get married to someone equally practical, buy a house, and repeat the cycle with children of my own. Art was never part of the plan. My first memory of creating something beautiful was in second grade, when Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, gave us an assignment to illustrate our favorite book. While other kids drew stick figures and basic shapes, I spent hours working on a detailed scene from Charlotte's Web, complete with a barn that showed proper perspective and a spider web that actually looked like it could catch flies. Mrs. Patterson held my drawing up to the class and said I had an artist's eye. When I brought it home, my mother hung it on the refrigerator with appropriate praise, but I noticed she removed it after a few days to make room for more practical items like grocery lists and appointment reminders. Throughout elementary school, I found myself drawn to visual projects. I volunteered to make posters for school events, designed my own birthday party invitations, and spent allowance money on art supplies rather than toys or candy. My parents viewed this as a harmless hobby, the way other children might be interested in sports or music lessons. The first real conflict came in 7th grade when my art teacher, Mr. Hendricks, suggested I apply for a summer art program at Dow, the local community college. The program was designed for gifted young artists and would have given me access to professional quality supplies and instruction from working artists. "It's a waste of money," my father said when I brought home the application. "Summer should be for getting a job and learning responsibility, not playing around with paints." "But Dad, Mr. Hendricks says I have real talent. He thinks I could get a scholarship to art school someday." My mother looked up from the bills she was paying at the kitchen table. "Scholarships are for academics, sweetheart. Focus on your math and science grades. Those are the subjects that matter for getting into a good college." Instead of the art program. I spent that summer working at my uncle's landscaping business, pulling weeds and learning to operate a push mower. The work was hard and hot, but I found myself fascinated by the way different plants and colors could be arranged to create beautiful spaces. I started sketching garden designs in a notebook I kept hidden in my backpack. High school brought new opportunities and deeper conflicts. I enrolled in every art class available, from basic drawing to advanced placement studio art. My teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was a working artist who taught part-time to support her own creative practice. She was the first adult who spoke to me seriously about art as a career possibility. "You have technical skill," she told me during my sophomore year. "But more importantly, you have vision. You see things differently than other people, and that's something that can't be taught." She encouraged me to enter local art competitions and helped me build a portfolio of work that went far beyond typical high school projects. I won several regional contests, and by my junior year, college recruiters were sending me information about art programs and potential scholarships. Each achievement created tension at home. When I won first place in a statewide high school art competition, earning a $500 prize, my parents attended the awards ceremony but seemed uncomfortable among the other families who talked enthusiastically about their children's artistic futures. "It's nice that you won," my father said on the drive home, "but don't let it go to your head. Art is a hobby, not a career. You need to focus on subjects that will actually help you support yourself." The real battle began during my senior year when college applications were due. I had researched art programs at schools across California, from prestigious private institutions to solid state university programs. Several schools had expressed serious interest in my work, including UC Davis, which had both strong academics and a respected art department. My parents had different ideas. They wanted me to apply to Cal State schools close to home for business administration or education. The compromise we reached felt like a victory at the time, but would later prove to be the source of ongoing conflict. I would attend UC Davis, but I would major in something practical with a minor in art. After much negotiation, we settled on communications with a focus on marketing, which my father deemed useful in the real world, while still allowing me to take art classes. The first 2 years of college were a constant internal struggle. I dutifully attended marketing and business classes, maintaining good grades and telling myself I was being responsible. But every art class felt like coming home to myself. I spent far more time in the art studios than in the library studying for my major classes. Professor Elizabeth Kim, who taught advanced digital design, became a mentor who helped me see possibilities I had never considered. She had worked for major advertising agencies before returning to academia and understood both the creative and commercial aspects of visual communication. There are ways to make art your career without being a starving artist, she told me during my junior year. Graphic design, web design, user experience design, these fields value creativity but also pay well. This revelation led to my decision to switch majors during my junior year, from communications to graphic design. The change required extra credits and delayed my graduation by a semester, decisions that caused significant stress at home. "We're paying for you to get a degree that will support you," my mother said during one particularly heated phone conversation. "Not to play around with computers and drawings?" Graphic design is a real career, Mom. Companies need people who can create websites and advertisements and marketing materials. Companies need accountants and managers and people who understand business, my father interjected, having picked up the extension phone. "This art thing has gone too far, Rebecca. It's time to be realistic about your future." The tension reached its peak during my senior year, when I announced my intention to move to Portland after graduation. I had been accepted into a graduate program in digital design, but I had also been offered the job at the marketing firm. My parents saw the job as validation that I was finally being practical, while I viewed it as a stepping stone to building a freelance design career. "Portland is expensive," my mother warned, "and you don't know anyone there. Why not take a job here in Sacramento and live at home for a year while you save money?" The suggestion felt like a trap, a return to the safe, predictable life I had been trying to escape since high school. I had spent 4 years compromising my artistic dreams for their version of security, and the idea of moving back home felt like admitting defeat before I had even tried to succeed on my own terms. "I need to do this, Mom. I need to try to make it on my own." "But what if you fail?" she asked, her voice carrying all the worry and love of a mother who wanted to protect her child from disappointment. "What if the job doesn't work out? Or you can't afford the rent? Or you get sick and don't have family nearby to help you?" Those fears had proven remarkably prescient. The job had been exactly as unstable as they had predicted. The rent had stretched my budget to the breaking point. And now, sitting in a hospital chair next to an elderly woman I barely knew, I was facing exactly the kind of crisis my parents had worried about. But instead of feeling like their predictions had come true, I felt something unexpected: gratitude. The struggle had been real, but it had also led me to discover parts of myself I never would have found in the safety of my childhood home. The financial stress had forced me to be resourceful and independent. The isolation had made me more open to forming connections with people like Mrs. Chen, who would have remained a stranger if I had been surrounded by familiar faces and comfortable routines. Most surprisingly, the constant uncertainty had taught me that I was stronger and more resilient than anyone, including myself, had believed possible. As I watched Mrs. Chen sleep peacefully in her hospital bed, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with my parents in the morning. They would want me to come home now, to admit that the Portland experiment had failed, and return to their version of safety and security. But the fire had shown me something my parents' careful planning never could have taught me. Sometimes the most important moments of growth come not from following a predetermined path, but from responding with grace and courage when that path disappears entirely. The girl who had left Riverside 18 months ago would have been devastated by losing everything she owned. The woman I had become through struggle and uncertainty saw it as an opportunity for a new kind of adventure, one that couldn't be planned or predicted, only lived one day at a time. The first sign that something was wrong with my Portland life came 3 months after I moved into the Industrial Boulevard apartment. Janet Crawford, my boss at Pinnacle Marketing, called me into her office on a Friday afternoon with an apologetic expression that I would come to recognize all too well. "Rebecca, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to delay your health insurance enrollment for another month. The company we're switching to has some paperwork issues, and our accountant says we can't process new enrollments until they're resolved." This was the third delay since I had started working there. Janet always had reasonable explanations, and she always seemed genuinely sorry, but the pattern was becoming clear. Pinnacle Marketing was barely holding together financially, and employee benefits were apparently the first casualty of their cash flow problems. "What does that mean for my coverage in the meantime?" I asked. "Well, technically you're still in your probationary period, so you wouldn't have been covered yet anyway. This just extends that period a bit longer." I left her office feeling uneasy, but telling myself it was temporary. Janet had promised me a full-time position with benefits after 6 months, and I was only 3 months in. Surely things would stabilize. Soon, they didn't. Over the following weeks, other small signs of instability appeared. Paychecks that were supposed to be direct deposited on Fridays sometimes didn't appear until the following Tuesday. Janet would explain that the bank had been slow to process the payroll, or that she had forgotten to submit the paperwork on time, or that there had been a technical issue with their accounting software. My coworkers, I discovered, had learned to adapt to these irregularities. Marcus Thompson, the senior graphic designer, kept a detailed log of missed or late payments. Sarah Kim, who handled social media accounts, had a side job teaching fitness classes to supplement her unpredictable income from Pinnacle. "The work is interesting," Marcus told me during one of our conversations at the coffee shop next door. "And Janet really does care about doing good work for clients. She's just not great at the business side of running a business." "How long have you been dealing with this?" "About 2 years. It's gotten worse in the last 6 months, but she always manages to catch up eventually. The clients pay their bills, so the money is there. It just takes a while to trickle down to us sometimes." I wanted to believe that this was normal for small companies, that the stability I was used to from my parents' government and corporate jobs was the exception rather than the rule. But the irregular paychecks made budgeting almost impossible. I never knew exactly when money would be available, which made it difficult to plan for rent, groceries, or any other expenses. The apartment itself began showing its age in ways the landlord seemed reluctant to address. The heating system worked sporadically, leaving me to bundle up in blankets during Portland's damp winter months. The hot water was inconsistent, sometimes scalding hot and sometimes lukewarm at best. When I reported these issues to the building management company, they promised to send someone to look at them, but weeks would pass without any follow-up. "The building's old," explained Dave Morrison, the maintenance supervisor who finally showed up to examine my heater in March. "These units were installed in the 1970s, and parts are hard to find. We'll get to it when we can, but it might take a while." My neighbors were dealing with similar problems. The Hendersons in 2B had been without a working stove for 3 weeks. Mrs. Chen's bathroom faucet had been dripping steadily for months, creating a water stain on the ceiling of the apartment below hers. The building's single elevator broke down regularly, forcing everyone to use the stairs, which was particularly difficult for elderly residents like Mrs. Chen. Despite these issues, rent increases arrived like clockwork every 12 months. My lease renewal notice informed me that my monthly rent would increase by $75, effective immediately. When I called the management company to ask about the increase, given the ongoing maintenance problems, I was told that rent adjustments were standard practice and reflected current market rates in the area. The financial pressure intensified when my student loan grace period ended. The monthly payment of $287 might not have seemed overwhelming under different circumstances, but combined with irregular paychecks and increasing rent, it pushed my budget beyond its breaking point. I started taking on freelance design work in the evenings and weekends, accepting any project I could find regardless of the pay rate. A logo design for a local restaurant that should have paid $500 netted me $200 after the owner complained about revisions and negotiated down the final payment. A website project for a small nonprofit took 3 times longer than estimated because they kept changing their requirements, ultimately paying less per hour than I could have earned working at a coffee shop. The freelance work helped cover basic expenses, but it left me exhausted and stressed. I was working essentially 2 full-time jobs, often staying up past midnight to meet deadlines, then dragging myself to the Pinnacle office the next morning to put in another 8 hours for Janet. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My diet deteriorated to whatever was cheapest and fastest to prepare. Pasta with generic sauce, peanut butter sandwiches, instant oatmeal for breakfast. I stopped buying fresh vegetables because they spoiled too quickly and I couldn't afford to waste food. My social life, which had never been robust in Portland, disappeared entirely. I couldn't afford to go out for drinks with coworkers or attend the networking events that might have helped me build professional connections. When friends from college visited Portland, I had to decline dinner invitations because restaurant meals weren't in my budget. The isolation was perhaps worse than the financial stress. I had moved to Portland partly to escape the feeling of being trapped in my parents' expectations. But I found myself more trapped than ever by circumstances I couldn't control. At least at home, I had been surrounded by people who cared about me. In Portland, I felt invisible most of the time. Mrs. Chen became one of the few bright spots in this increasingly difficult period. Our friendship had developed gradually, starting with polite hallway greetings and evolving into regular coffee visits in her apartment. She was lonely, and I was stressed, and somehow we found comfort in each other's company. "You work too much," she would tell me, watching me edit design files on my laptop while sitting at her kitchen table. When I was young in China, we worked hard, but we also knew when to rest. She would make tea and tell stories about her late husband, Wei, who had been an engineer before they immigrated to America in the 1960s. He had taken a job as a janitor because his Chinese engineering credentials weren't recognized here, but he had never stopped learning, eventually starting his own small construction business. He always said America was the place where you could reinvent yourself if you were willing to work for it, Mrs. Chen told me. But he also said the work was supposed to lead somewhere, not just work for the sake of working. Her words stayed with me during the long nights when I questioned whether I was building towards something meaningful or simply running in place. The freelance projects were rarely creatively fulfilling, and my work at Pinnacle felt increasingly pointless as the company's disorganization became more apparent. By early fall, I had been living paycheck to paycheck for so long that any unexpected expense felt like a crisis. When my laptop, which was essential for both my regular job and freelance work, started showing signs of failure, I faced an impossible choice. I could use my credit card to buy a replacement, adding debt I couldn't afford to pay off, or I could try to make the aging machine last longer and risk losing both income sources if it failed completely. I chose to wait, a decision that increased my anxiety every time the laptop took longer than usual to start up or froze during important projects. I began backing up files obsessively and saving work more frequently than necessary, constantly worried that the next crash might be the final one. The stress began affecting my health in ways I initially tried to ignore. I was getting sick more frequently, probably due to poor nutrition and lack of sleep. My concentration suffered, making both my regular job and freelance work less efficient. I started making mistakes that required extra time to correct, further reducing my already tight schedule. Most concerning was the way chronic stress was affecting my perspective on everything. Problems that would have seemed manageable under normal circumstances felt overwhelming. Small setbacks, like a client requesting revisions or Janet changing project requirements at the last minute, would leave me feeling defeated for days. Stopped calling my parents regularly because I didn't want to worry them or admit how difficult things had become. When they asked how I was doing during our brief conversations, I gave vague positive answers and changed the subject as quickly as possible. "Everything's fine, Mom. Work is busy, but that's good. How are things at home?" The lie became easier with repetition, but it also increased my sense of isolation. I was struggling more than I had ever struggled before, but I couldn't admit it to the people who cared most about me without also admitting that their concerns about my move to Portland had been justified. By November, I had started seriously considering moving back to Sacramento. The Portland experiment wasn't working, and pride seemed like a poor reason to continue suffering. But even that option felt complicated. Moving required money I didn't have for deposits and truck rental. It meant admitting failure to my parents and returning to their world of careful planning and conservative choices. Most of all, it meant abandoning Mrs. Chen, who had become increasingly dependent on my regular visits. Her health had been declining, gradually over the months I had known her, and she had mentioned several times that I was her only regular social contact. "I don't know what I would do without you," she had said recently, and I knew she meant it literally as well as emotionally. As winter approached, I found myself trapped between financial necessity and human obligation, between the practical choice of giving up and the emotional impossibility of abandoning someone who needed me. I had no way of knowing that this impossible situation was about to resolve itself in the most unexpected way possible, or that Mrs. Chen's increasing frailty would ultimately save both our lives. The morning after my father's call, I woke up in the hospital chair with a stiff neck and the disorienting sensation that comes from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. Mrs. Chen was awake, sitting up in bed, and looking more alert than she had in days. A nurse was checking her vital signs and making notes on a tablet. "Her blood pressure is much better," the nurse, whose name tag read Jennifer, told me. "The IV fluids have helped significantly. Dr. Patel will be making rounds in about an hour to discuss discharge planning." Mrs. Chen squeezed my hand. "Rebecca, you should go home and rest properly. I'm feeling much better now." The irony of her suggestion hit me fresh. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, I don't have a home to go to right now." Jennifer looked up from her tablet. "What do you mean?" I explained about the fire, watching both their expressions change from confusion to shock to sympathy. Jennifer had heard about the Industrial Boulevard fire on the news but hadn't connected it to her patient's visitor. "Oh my goodness. You've been here taking care of Mrs. Chen while your own apartment was burning down?" "That's incredible." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "Rebecca, why didn't you tell me? You should have left to deal with your own problems." "There was nothing I could have done about the fire, Mrs. Chen. But there was something I could do for you. That seemed more important." Dr. Patel arrived for rounds 30 minutes later, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had been treating Mrs. Chen since she arrived. He confirmed that her condition had stabilized dramatically overnight and that she could be discharged that afternoon, but he had concerns about her living situation. "Mrs. Chen, you live alone, correct? And this episode was caused by not eating properly and becoming dehydrated. I'm worried about you going home without some kind of support system." "I'll check on her," I said automatically. "I've been doing that anyway." Dr. Patel looked at me curiously. "But didn't I understand that you've just lost your own housing? Where will you be staying?" It was a question I hadn't fully confronted yet. In the emotional aftermath of the fire and my father's call, I had been operating on adrenaline and the immediate need to care for Mrs. Chen. But now, in the harsh fluorescent light of morning, the practical realities were becoming unavoidable. Had no apartment, no clothes except what I was wearing, no toiletries, no bed to sleep in. My laptop was gone, along with all my freelance work files. My car was parked in the hospital garage, but everything else I owned had been reduced to ash and water damage. Not sure yet, I admitted. I need to contact my insurance company and see what temporary housing assistance might be available. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. Well, Mrs. Chen definitely shouldn't be alone for the next few days. Perhaps you could stay with her temporarily while you figure out your own situation. It would actually be ideal from a medical standpoint. Mrs. Chen's apartment had escaped the fire that destroyed mine, since it was on a different floor and the flames had apparently spread upward and to the sides rather than downward. The building was still uninhabitable due to smoke and water damage, but the emergency management team was allowing residents to retrieve essential items under supervision. After Dr. Patel completed his rounds, I called my father to update him on the situation. He and my mother had spent the night researching Portland hotels and temporary housing options, preparing to drive north to help me. "Rebecca, we're leaving Sacramento in an hour," he said. "You need clothes and a place to stay, and you need help dealing with insurance and finding a new apartment." "Dad, I appreciate that, but Mrs. Chen is being discharged today and she can't be alone. Her apartment might still be livable, and I could stay there for a few days while I figure things out." There was a long pause. "You want to stay in the building that just caught fire?" "Parts of the building are still structurally sound. The fire department and building inspectors are evaluating each unit individually." "Rebecca, this is exactly the kind of impractical thinking that got you into this situation in the first place. You need to come home, get stable, and make rational decisions about your future." His words stung because they carried an uncomfortable grain of truth. My decision to move to Portland, to take an unstable job, to live paycheck to paycheck without proper insurance, all of it could be seen as a series of impractical choices that had led to this disaster. But something had shifted in my perspective during the long night in the hospital. The crisis had clarified priorities in a way that months of gradual decline had not. Mrs. Chen needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That felt more meaningful than any of the career ambitions or financial goals I had been struggling to achieve. "Dad, I understand your concern, but I need to do this. Mrs. Chen doesn't have anyone else. She's not your responsibility, Rebecca. You've already done more than enough by staying with her in the hospital." Maybe she's not my responsibility in the traditional sense, but she's become my family, and the family takes care of each other. After we hung up, I could feel the weight of disappointing my parents again, of making another choice they would view as impractical and potentially harmful. But for the first time since moving to Portland, I felt confident that I was making the right decision for the right reasons. The building inspection that afternoon revealed that Mrs. Chen's apartment had suffered primarily smoke damage. The structure was sound, and while the smell was unpleasant and some of her belongings would need professional cleaning, it was habitable with proper ventilation. My own apartment was a total loss. When the fire marshal allowed me to view it briefly, I saw that everything had been destroyed either by flames or by water from the firefighting efforts. The walls were blackened, the ceiling had partially collapsed, and my possessions were unrecognizable beneath layers of soot and debris. Standing in what had been my living room, I felt a strange sense of detachment. These charred remains had been my life just 24 hours ago. My furniture, my clothes, my books, my carefully organized workspace. Now they looked like artifacts from someone else's existence. The fire marshal, a woman named Captain Rivera, explained what they had, determined about the fire's origin and spread. "It started in the electrical room on the second floor," she said, pointing to a section of the building where the damage was most severe. "The wiring in this building is original to 1978, and it wasn't up to current safety standards. We've seen several fires in older apartment buildings with similar electrical systems. Was it preventable? Hard to say definitively. The building owner should have been updating the electrical systems regularly, but there's no legal requirement to retrofit older buildings unless they're being substantially renovated. It's one of those gaps in building safety regulations. Other tenants were arriving to assess their own losses. I recognized several neighbors I had exchanged greetings with over the past 18 months, though I realized I didn't actually know most of their names. We were all strangers who had happened to live in the same building, and now we were strangers who had happened to lose our homes in the same fire. The Henderson family from 2B was there with their 2 young children, who seemed to treat the fire-damaged building as an adventure rather than a tragedy. Mrs. Henderson looked exhausted and overwhelmed as she tried to salvage photo albums and children's toys from their smoke-damaged apartment. "We don't have renter's insurance either," she confided to me as we waited for our turn with the fire marshal. "Tom always said we'd get it next month, but next month never came. Now we're staying with my sister in Beaverton, but she only has a 1-bedroom apartment. I don't know what we're going to do long-term." Marcus Williams, the jazz musician from 2C, had lost his entire collection of vintage saxophones and music equipment. He stood in his doorway, staring at the waterlogged remains of instruments that had been his livelihood as well as his passion. "Some of those horns were irreplaceable," he told me. "I had a 1954 Selmer Mark VI that my grandfather left me. You can't buy history like that." The scope of collective loss was staggering. 15 apartments, each containing someone's entire life, reduced to debris that would be hauled away in dumpsters. Behind each door were stories of photographs that couldn't be replaced, heirlooms passed down through generations, children's artwork, love letters, the accumulated possessions that make a space feel like home. But I also noticed something unexpected in the way people talked to each other that afternoon. Neighbors who had lived in parallel isolation for years were sharing personal stories and contact information. The Hendersons offered to help Mrs. Chen with anything she needed while she recovered. Marcus gave me his phone number and said he knew about temporary housing resources for displaced residents. The crisis had created an instant community among people who had previously been strangers. We were all facing similar challenges: finding places to stay, dealing with insurance companies, replacing essential items, and there was comfort in shared experience. That evening, I helped Mrs. Chen settle back into her apartment, opening windows to air out the smoke smell and helping her sort through belongings to determine what could be cleaned and what needed to be discarded. Her apartment had been largely spared from direct fire damage, but everything was coated with a thin layer of soot, and the smell of smoke permeated every fabric surface. "Rebecca," she said as we worked together to wipe down her kitchen cabinets, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't found me when you did. If I had been alone in the hospital during the fire, I would have been so frightened and confused. I hadn't considered this aspect of the timing. If Mrs. Chen had been in her apartment when the fire started, would she have been able to evacuate quickly enough? Her mobility was limited, and she sometimes became disoriented when awakened suddenly. The thought of her trapped and alone during those terrifying hours was almost unbearable. But that didn't happen," I told her. "We were both exactly where we needed to be." As I made up a bed for myself on Mrs. Chen's couch that night, I reflected on the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. Mrs. Chen's illness had seemed like another burden in an already overwhelming life. One more crisis to manage on top of financial stress and job instability. But that apparent burden had become the very thing that saved both our lives. If she hadn't gotten sick, I would have been asleep in apartment 3A when the fire started. If I hadn't cared enough to stay with her at the hospital, I would have returned home to face the flames. If I hadn't been willing to sacrifice my own comfort for someone else's need, the story would have ended very differently. The realization was both humbling and empowering. The qualities my parents viewed as impractical, my willingness to prioritize relationships over financial security, my tendency to get emotionally involved in other people's problems, had literally saved my life. As I drifted off to sleep on Mrs. Chen's small sofa, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the sound of her peaceful breathing from the next room. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with career advancement or financial success. The fire had taken my possessions, but it had also burned away the illusions and anxieties that had been keeping me trapped in an unsustainable life. What remained was clarity about what actually mattered, and the unexpected discovery that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present for another person when they need you most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: insurance, claims, housing searches, difficult conversations with my parents, decisions about whether to stay in Portland or return to California. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, caring for someone who had become family and being cared for in return by the simple act of sharing space and mutual concern. The catastrophe that should have destroyed everything had instead revealed the foundation that had been there all along, the human connections that make survival not just possible, but meaningful. 3 days after the fire, I was sitting at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table with a laptop borrowed from Marcus Williams, trying to navigate the maze of insurance claims and disaster relief applications, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Martinez? This is Detective Sarah Vaughn with the Portland Fire Investigation Unit. I'd like to ask you some questions about the Industrial Boulevard apartment fire. My stomach dropped. Am I in some kind of trouble? Not at all. We're conducting a routine investigation into the cause and circumstances of the fire, and we'd like to speak with all the residents. Would you have time to meet today? We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the hospital, since I was planning to take Mrs. Chen to a follow-up appointment with Dr. Patel that afternoon. Detective Vaughn was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many preventable tragedies. "Tell me about the weeks leading up to the fire," she said, settling into the booth across from me with a notebook and digital recorder. "Did you notice anything unusual about the building? Any maintenance? Work, strange smells, electrical problems?" I described the ongoing issues I had reported to the building management company: the inconsistent heating, the electrical outlets that sometimes sparked when I plugged in appliances, the way the lights would flicker during storms. Details that had seemed like normal old building quirks now took on more sinister significance. "Did you ever see anyone working in the electrical room or utility areas?" "Not recently, but there were always maintenance people around for different problems. The elevator broke down at least once a month, and there were always plumbing issues in different apartments." Detective Vaughn made notes as I talked, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or specific incidents. Her questions were thorough but not accusatory, and gradually I began to understand that this wasn't just a routine follow-up. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to share some information with you that isn't public yet, but we believe there may have been negligence involved in this fire. The electrical system in your building hadn't been properly maintained or updated in decades. The building owner, Pacific Northwest Properties, has been cited for similar violations at other properties." She showed me a photograph of the electrical panel where the fire had started. Even to my untrained eye, the mess of outdated wiring and makeshift connections looked dangerous. "We're building a case that could result in criminal charges against the property management company and possibly the building owner. Would you be willing to testify about the maintenance issues you experienced?" I thought about Mrs. Henderson trying to salvage her children's toys from their smoke-damaged apartment, about Marcus losing his grandfather's saxophone, about all of us who had trusted that our homes met basic safety standards. Absolutely. That conversation marked the beginning of my transformation from victim to advocate. Over the following days, I connected with other displaced tenants to share information about our experiences with building maintenance issues. What emerged was a pattern of systematic negligence that went far beyond my individual apartment. The heating system had been failing in multiple units for months. Several residents reported electrical problems that had been either ignored or inadequately addressed by maintenance staff. the building's smoke detectors were inconsistently maintained, with some units having batteries that hadn't been changed in over 2 years. Most disturbing was the discovery that Pacific Northwest Properties managed 17 other apartment buildings in Portland, many with similar maintenance problems and safety violations. A tenant advocacy group called Portland Housing Justice had been tracking complaints against the company for years. Lisa Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, was a lawyer who volunteered with Portland Housing Justice. She agreed to meet with our group of displaced tenants to discuss legal options. Property management companies like Pacific Northwest rely on tenants not knowing their rights, she explained during our first meeting in the community room of a local library. They make minimal investments in maintenance and safety improvements because they assume most tenants won't complain or won't know how to complain effectively. But we did complain, protested James Rodriguez, who had lived in apartment 1C with his elderly mother. I called the management company at least 6 times about the electrical problems in our unit. Did you ever put those complaints in writing? Did you ever file complaints with the city's building inspection department? Most of us, myself included, had only made phone calls or mentioned problems to maintenance staff during unrelated visits. We had trusted that verbal complaints would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. That's exactly what they count on, Lisa said. Verbal complaints are easy to ignore or claim they never received. Written complaints create a paper trail that can be used as evidence of negligence. She helped us understand that we had legal grounds not just for recovering damages from the fire, but for holding Pacific Northwest Properties accountable for a pattern of negligence that had endangered tenants across multiple buildings. This isn't just about getting compensation for what you lost in the fire, Lisa explained. It's about preventing the same thing from happening to other tenants in other buildings. The prospect of taking on a large property management company felt intimidating, but it also felt necessary. I thought about Mrs. Chen, who could have died if she had been in her apartment when the fire started, and about all the other elderly and vulnerable tenants living in Pacific Northwest Properties who were trusting that their homes met basic safety standards. My parents arrived in Portland the following Saturday, despite my attempts to convince them I was managing the situation adequately. They had driven up with a rented SUV full of clothes, toiletries, and household essentials they thought I would need. "Rebecca, you're sleeping on an old woman's couch in a building that just caught fire," my mother said as she surveyed Mrs. Chen's smoke-damaged apartment. "This isn't sustainable." "The building inspector cleared this apartment as safe for occupancy, Mom, and Mrs. Chen needs help while she's recovering." My father was examining the windows, which we kept open to ventilate the lingering smoke smell. "The whole building should be condemned. Look at this wiring," he said, pointing to an electrical outlet that was slightly blackened around the edges. Mrs. Chen, who had been napping when my parents arrived, emerged from her bedroom to meet them. Despite the language barrier and cultural differences, she and my mother immediately connected over their shared concern for my well-being. "Rebecca is a good girl," Mrs. Chen told my mother in her careful English. "She take care of me when I was sick. I take care of her now." My father, always more comfortable with practical matters than emotional ones, focused on the logistics of my situation. He had researched rental prices in Portland and calculated that I would need at least $3,000 for deposits and first month's rent on a new apartment, money I didn't have. "Come home with us," he urged during a private conversation while my mother and Mrs. Chen looked through old photo albums together. "Just temporarily, until you can save up enough to get back on your feet properly." "Dad, I can't abandon Mrs. Chen right now. And I can't abandon this legal case. Other people are depending on me to help hold Pacific Northwest Properties accountable." "You're not a lawyer, Rebecca. You're not a social worker. You're a graphic designer who just lost everything," she owned. "Let the professionals handle the legal case. The professionals need tenants to testify about what we experienced. Without our testimony, Pacific Northwest gets away with endangering people's lives." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the expression he had always worn when trying to understand my motivations. "This isn't really about the legal case, is it?" This is about proving something to yourself. His insight was uncomfortably accurate. Part of my determination to stay in Portland and see the legal case through was indeed about proving that I could handle a crisis without running home to my parents. But it was also about something larger. Dad, for the past 18 months, I've been struggling just to survive. Working 2 jobs, barely paying rent, constantly worried about money. I was so focused on just getting by that I wasn't really living. This fire, as terrible as it was, has shown me what actually matters. It's not about the apartment or the possessions I lost. It's about being useful to people who need help. You can be useful to people in Sacramento, too. I know, but these people, this situation, this is where I'm needed right now. My mother joined our conversation, having finished looking at Mrs. Chen's photo albums. She really does need you, Rebecca. She told me you're the only family she has here. Which is exactly why Rebecca shouldn't tie herself down to someone else's problems, my father responded. She's 29 years old. She should be building her own career, her own family, her own future. Maybe taking care of people is part of building a future, my mother said quietly. Maybe there are different ways to build a meaningful life. I was surprised to hear my mother, who had always supported my father's practical approach to life planning, suggesting an alternative perspective. But spending time with Mrs. Chen seemed to have affected her too. She reminds me of my grandmother, my mother explained. Alone in a country where she never quite fit, but still trying to contribute something meaningful. When I was your age, I thought success meant checking off boxes. Good job, nice house, financial security. But sitting with Mrs. Chen today, listening to her stories about coming to America and building a life here, I remembered that some of the most important things can't be planned or measured. That evening, my parents and I had dinner with Mrs. Chen at her kitchen table, sharing Chinese takeout and talking about our different perspectives on success and responsibility. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had about our conflicting values and expectations. I still think you should have renter's insurance, my father said with a slight smile. Some practical considerations are actually important. I'll definitely get renter's insurance next time, I agreed. And I still think you should consider moving back home, at least temporarily, while you figure out your next steps. I understand why you think that, Dad, but I need to see this through. Mrs. Chen needs help, and this legal case could prevent other families from losing their homes the way we did. He nodded slowly. I don't like it, but I respect your decision. Just promise me you'll be smart about it. Don't sacrifice your own future for someone else's present needs. Over the following week, my parents helped me navigate the practical aspects of recovery while respecting my decision to stay in Portland. My father used his accounting skills to help me organize documentation for insurance claims and disaster relief applications. My mother spent time with Mrs. Chen, helping her sort through damaged belongings and teaching her some basic English phrases that might help her communicate better with medical providers. The legal case began moving forward, more quickly than Lisa Chen had initially predicted. Detective Vaughn's investigation had uncovered evidence that Pacific Northwest Properties had known about electrical problems in multiple buildings, but had chosen to delay repairs to save money. The district attorney's office was considering criminal charges in addition to the civil lawsuit our tenant group was pursuing. This could set an important precedent, Lisa explained during one of our group meetings. Property management companies need to understand that neglecting tenant safety has serious consequences. My role in the case was expanding beyond just giving testimony about my own experiences. Because I had time available and basic computer skills, I began helping other displaced tenants document their losses and organize evidence. It felt like meaningful work in a way that my job at Pinnacle Marketing never had. Janet Crawford, my former boss, had called several times to check on me and discuss when I might be able to return to work. The fire had given me a legitimate reason to take time off. But I was beginning to realize that I didn't want to go back to that chaotic, underpaid, unfulfilling job. I'm thinking about making some changes, I told her during our most recent conversation. What kind of changes? I'm not sure yet, but this whole experience has made me rethink what I want to do with my career. Rebecca, I understand that the fire was traumatic, but don't make any big life decisions while you're still in crisis mode. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back. But I was beginning to understand that crisis mode might actually be the best time to make big life decisions. When everything safe and familiar is stripped away, you can finally see clearly what you actually want to build in its place. 2 months after the fire, I was sitting in a conference room on the 15th floor of a downtown Portland office building, facing a panel of lawyers representing Pacific Northwest properties. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, and the polished mahogany table could have seated 20 people. It was the kind of impressive corporate setting designed to intimidate, and for a moment, it worked. Across from me sat Richard Sterling, Pacific Northwest's lead attorney, a man in his 60s wearing a suit that probably cost more than I had ever made in a month. Beside him were 2 younger associates taking notes on tablets, and a woman I didn't recognize who had been introduced as the company's insurance representative. Our side of the table looked decidedly less polished. Lisa Chen had brought her law partner David Kim, who specialized in tenant rights cases. Mrs. Henderson was there with her husband Tom, both looking uncomfortable in their best clothes. Marcus Williams wore a borrowed tie that was slightly too short. Mrs. Chen sat beside me, wearing a navy blue dress she had owned since the 1980s but had pressed carefully for the occasion. "Before we begin formal depositions," Sterling said, opening a leather portfolio, "Pacific Northwest Properties would like to present a settlement offer that we believe fairly compensates all affected tenants for their losses." He slid papers across the table to Lisa Chen, who reviewed them quickly before passing copies to each of us. The numbers were larger than I had expected, $25,000 per affected unit, plus moving expenses and temporary housing assistance. "This is a generous offer," Sterling continued, "and it comes with no admission of liability on our client's part. We're simply trying to help people rebuild their lives after an unfortunate accident." Mrs. Henderson leaned over to whisper to her husband, and I could see them doing quick calculations. $25,000 would go a long way toward replacing their children's belongings and covering the costs of finding a new apartment. For people who had been living paycheck to paycheck, it represented real financial relief. Marcus was studying his copy of the settlement agreement with a frown. "What about the criminal investigation? Detective Vaughn said there might be charges filed." "That's a separate matter entirely," Sterling replied smoothly. "This settlement agreement has no bearing on any ongoing investigations by law enforcement agencies." Lisa Chen looked up from the documents. "I need to confer with my clients before we can respond to this offer. Could we have some time to discuss it privately?" Sterling checked his expensive watch. "Of course. We'll step out for 15 minutes. Once we were alone, the room felt less intimidating, but the decision ahead felt more complex. $25,000 was more money than I had ever had at one time, enough to get properly established in a new apartment, maybe even start the freelance business I had always dreamed of pursuing. "What do you think?" Lisa asked, looking around the table at each of us. Tom Henderson was the first to speak. "It's a lot of money for us. More than we could probably win if we went to trial, considering we don't have receipts for everything. We lost. But if we take the settlement, they get away with it," Marcus said. "They get to keep managing buildings with dangerous electrical systems, and other families might go through what we went through." Mrs. Chen, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up in her careful English. "In China, when I was young, landlords could do anything to tenants because tenants had no power. In America, I thought it was different." Her words reminded me of something Detective Vaughn had told me the previous week. The criminal investigation was moving slowly because the Pacific Northwest had hired expensive attorneys who were challenging every piece of evidence. Without strong testimony from tenants, the case might not succeed in court. If we take the settlement, does that help or hurt the criminal case? I asked Lisa. It doesn't directly impact the criminal case, but it might make other tenants in their buildings less likely to come forward with complaints. Settlement agreements like this often include confidentiality clauses. She showed us the fine print we hadn't initially noticed. By accepting the settlement, we would agree not to discuss the details of our case publicly, or encourage other tenants to file similar complaints. They're not just buying our silence about this fire, David Kim explained. They're buying our silence about their entire business model. The revelation changed the calculation entirely. This wasn't just about compensating us for our losses. It was about the Pacific Northwest's attempt to prevent accountability for their systematic negligence across dozens of buildings. When Sterling and his team returned, Lisa Chen delivered our response. My clients need more time to consider this offer. We'd also like to see the inspection reports for all Pacific Northwest properties, as well as maintenance records for the Industrial Boulevard building for the past 5 years. Sterling's confident demeanor shifted slightly. I'm not sure that information is relevant to settling the claims related to this specific incident. It's relevant to determining whether this was truly an unfortunate accident, as you characterized it, or part of a pattern of negligence that puts other tenants at risk. Ms. Chen, I think you're overcomplicating what should be a straightforward settlement discussion. My clients are offering generous compensation with no requirement that your clients prove damages or liability. Your clients are offering hush money, Marcus interjected, his voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. You want to pay us to pretend this never happened so you can keep collecting rent from people living in fire traps. Sterling's younger associates exchanged glances, but he maintained his professional composure. That's an unfair characterization, Mr. Williams. Pacific Northwest Properties maintains all its buildings in accordance with applicable codes and regulations. Then you won't mind sharing the maintenance records, Lisa Chen said. The meeting ended without resolution, but something important had shifted. Pacific Northwest's willingness to offer such a large settlement without any admission of liability suggested they were more worried about the case than they had initially let on. Over the following week, our legal team's investigation intensified. David Kim had filed requests for public records that revealed Pacific Northwest had received multiple code violations across their property portfolio over the past 3 years. Most violations had been resolved with minimal fines rather than required improvements. More significantly, Detective Vaughn's investigation had uncovered internal emails suggesting that Pacific Northwest executives were aware of electrical problems in several buildings, but had decided to delay repairs until they became absolutely necessary. This is the smoking gun we needed, Lisa Chen told us during a meeting at her office. These emails show conscious disregard for tenant safety in favor of cost savings. The district attorney's office announced criminal charges against Pacific Northwest Properties and 3 company executives the following Friday. The charges included reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to violate building safety codes. News of the criminal charges changed the dynamics of our civil case dramatically. Sterling called Lisa Chen's office within hours of the DA's announcement, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss revised settlement terms. This time, the meeting took place in Lisa Chen's modest conference room rather than Pacific Northwest's intimidating downtown offices. Sterling arrived with the same team, but their confidence had been replaced by barely concealed anxiety. In light of recent developments, Sterling began, Pacific Northwest is prepared to increase its settlement offer substantially. We're now proposing $50,000 per affected unit, plus full relocation assistance, and a commitment to upgrade electrical systems in all company properties within 6 months. The offer was tempting, but Lisa Chen had prepared us for this moment. What about the confidentiality clause? Sterling hesitated. We would still require that tenants refrain from encouraging frivolous lawsuits against the company. Define frivolous, David Kim interjected. claims that are not supported by substantial evidence of actual damages. Mrs. Chen, who had been listening carefully, spoke up again. What about other tenants in other buildings who are living with dangerous wiring right now? The electrical system upgrades would address any safety concerns across all properties, Sterling replied. But only if we stay quiet about what happened to us, I said. What about their right to know that their landlord has been cutting corners on safety? Sterling looked uncomfortable. Ms. Martinez, Pacific Northwest is offering you and the other tenants substantial compensation and a commitment to improve safety across all properties. This represents the best possible outcome for everyone involved. I thought about Mrs. Chen's words about landlords and tenants in China, about power and the lack of it. I thought about the families currently living in Pacific Northwest properties who had no idea they might be living in fire traps. I want to reject the settlement, I said. The room went quiet. Mrs. Henderson looked at me with surprise, and I could see her mentally calculating what my decision might mean for her family's financial situation. Rebecca, Tom Henderson said, carefully, $50,000 is life-changing money for people like us. I know, and I'm not asking anyone else to reject it. But I can't take money to stay quiet about something that could happen to other families. Mrs. Chen reached over and squeezed my hand. I reject it too, she said firmly. Marcus nodded slowly. Count me out as well. The Hendersons looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way that couples do after years of marriage. Finally, Tom spoke up. We have kids to think about. We need the money to get them properly settled in a safe place. I understand completely, I told them. This is about what each of us can live with. Lisa Chen addressed Sterling directly. 3 of my clients are rejecting your settlement offer. The Hendersons would like to accept, but without the confidentiality clause. Sterling conferred quietly with his associates before responding. We can modify the confidentiality requirements for the Hendersons, but the other 3 tenants are choosing to pursue this matter at trial with all the uncertainty and expense that entails. We understand, I said. After Sterling's team left, Lisa Chen outlined what our decision meant in practical terms. The trial could take months or even years. There was no guarantee we would win, and even if we did, Pacific Northwest might appeal. Or file for bankruptcy protection to avoid paying damages. Are you sure about this? She asked. Sterling was right that this is a substantial risk. I looked around the room at Mrs. Chen and Marcus, 2 people who had become family to me through a shared crisis and shared values. Chen had lived through situations where people with power could abuse those without it, and she understood the importance of fighting back when possible. Marcus had lost irreplaceable family heirlooms, but was still willing to risk financial recovery for the principle of accountability. I'm sure, I said. Some things are more important than money. The trial began 8 months later. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a slightly sickly appearance. But when the jury foreman read the verdict, finding Pacific Northwest Properties liable for gross negligence and awarding punitive damages of $2.3 million to be split among affected tenants, the modest setting felt like the most beautiful place in the world. Pacific Northwest was also required to upgrade electrical systems in all their properties within 90 days and submit to independent safety inspections quarterly for the next 5 years. More importantly, the case had attracted enough media attention that other tenant advocacy groups across the Pacific Northwest began filing similar lawsuits against negligent landlords. Our decision to reject the settlement and go to trial had created a precedent that would protect future tenants. As we left the courthouse that day, Mrs. Chen walked beside me with a smile I had never seen before. Not just happiness, but pride. And satisfaction that came from standing up for something important. Rebecca, she said, I think your parents would be proud of you. I thought about my father's practical wisdom and my mother's quiet strength and realized that everything they had taught me about responsibility and integrity had led to this moment. They had wanted me to build a stable, secure life, and in a way, that was exactly what I had done, just not in the way any of us had expected. 2 years after the fire, I walked into the grand ballroom of the Portland Hilton, adjusting the name tag that read, Rebecca Martinez, keynote speaker. The Pacific Northwest Housing Justice Conference had invited me to speak about tenant advocacy, and the room was filled with lawyers, social workers, and community organizers from across the region. As I stepped up to the podium, I spotted Mrs. Chen in the third row, wearing the pearl necklace she saved for special occasions. At 86, she had become one of Portland's most effective tenant advocates, using her gentle demeanor and persistent questions to hold landlords accountable in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. 3 years ago, I began, I was a struggling graphic designer living paycheck to paycheck in a building with dangerous wiring. Today, I run a successful advocacy firm that has helped over 200 families secure safe housing. The difference wasn't a career change. It was discovering that my purpose had been there all along. Martinez Advocacy Services now employed 5 people, including Marcus Williams as my partner, and 2 recent law school graduates who specialized in tenant rights. We had expanded beyond Portland, taking cases throughout Oregon and Washington. Our success rate in housing court exceeded 90%, and we had helped pass legislation requiring stricter building safety inspections. My parents visited every few months now, and our conversations had evolved from worried check-ins to collaborative planning sessions. My father used his accounting expertise to help develop financial literacy workshops for our clients, while my mother volunteered with Mrs. Chen to teach English to elderly immigrants facing housing discrimination. You know what I realized? My father had said during his last visit, watching me present a complex case strategy to our team. All those years I thought you were being impractical. You were actually being visionary. You just saw a different kind of security than I did. The financial security I had now was more stable than anything I had experienced before the fire. Our firm was profitable, and I owned a modest house with a yard where Mrs. Chen and I grew vegetables together. But more importantly, I had the security that comes from knowing your work matters and your choices align with your values. The legal victory against Pacific Northwest Properties had rippled far beyond our individual case. The precedent had been cited in dozens of similar lawsuits across the country. The company had eventually been dissolved, with its properties sold to nonprofit organizations committed to affordable housing. Detective Vaughn had called me the previous month with news that our case had contributed to new federal legislation strengthening penalties for landlords who endanger tenants through negligent maintenance. Your decision to go to trial instead of taking the settlement made this possible, she told me. Mrs. Chen and I still had coffee twice a week, though now we often discussed strategy for her latest advocacy project. She had organized the senior chief residents in her building to successfully demand better accessibility features and had started a support network for elderly tenants facing eviction. In China, I learned to keep my head down and not make trouble, she told me recently. In America, I learned that sometimes making trouble is the most patriotic thing you can do. As I concluded my speech at the conference, I returned to the question that had started everything. Why had I laughed when my father called to tell me my building was on fire? I laughed because somewhere deep inside, I knew that disaster was actually liberation. I was trapped in a life that looked responsible but felt meaningless. The fire didn't destroy my future. It revealed it. The audience gave me a standing ovation, but the moment that mattered most was seeing Mrs. Chen in the front row, applauding with tears in her eyes. After the speech, she came up to the stage. Rebecca, do you know what Wei would have said about tonight? What? He would have said that sometimes the best things grow in the places where everything else burned down. Walking back to my car that evening, I thought about the path that had led from that terrifying phone call to this moment of recognition and purpose. The fire had taken my possessions and my illusions about security, but it had given me something irreplaceable. The knowledge that I could rebuild not just a life, but a better life based on what actually mattered. When people ask me now about that night when I laughed at devastating news, I tell them it wasn't denial or shock. It was the sound of someone finally becoming free to be who they were meant to be all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.